This is Truth Frequency Radio.
The wicked ones obviously under heavy Masonic influence.
I've been a participant in some of the most insidious lies and witnessed to deeds that no crazed man could imagine. I spent years watching you from my lofty position to know that you were the one I could trust.
And why did you lie to me?
There still exist some secrets which should remain secret. Truths that people are just not ready to know.
Who are you to decide that?
The world's reaction to such knowledge would be far too dangerous.
Dangerous? You mean in the sense of outrage? Like the reaction to the Kennedy assassination, or MIAs, or radiation experiments on terminal patients. Watergate, Iran-Contra, Roswell, the Tuskegee experiments. Where will it end?
You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth!
Get out!
Or what? You'll kill me?
Always remember, dissension's the greatest form of patriotism.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies.
We have before us the opportunity to forge a new world order.
Yes, we can. And you say.
Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories.
A lie is most convincingly hidden between two truths.
Well, I guess it won't end.
No! I don't have time for this. This is about saving the future of humanity.
We know things are bad, worse than bad. We know the air is unfit to breathe and our food is unfit to eat. I don't want you to protest. I don't want you to write to your congressman because I wouldn't know what to tell you to write. I don't know what to do about the depression and the inflation and the crime in the street. All I know is that first, you've got to get mad.
The line must be drawn here. This far, no farther.
I want you to get up right now. Go to your windows, open them, and stick your head out and yell, I'm a human being. My life has value, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
You shall not pass!
You're listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project with your host, Rob Skiba.
Hello and welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and I'm excited about tonight's broadcast. I'm going to be talking with my friend and fellow Nephilim researcher, Dr. Judd Burton. Dr. Judd Burton is an historian and anthropologist who has conducted research on a number of topics, including giants, biblical and early Christian history, and the history of witchcraft. He has also been a part of archaeological expeditions around the globe, including Israel, Texas, and more recently, Peru. Dr. Burton received a PhD in history with a focus on religion from Texas Tech University and an MA in anthropology from the same institution. Currently, he is faculty in the Department of History and Philosophy at South Texas College, and he is also the director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology. And so, without further delay, let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Judd Burton, are you there, my friend?
I am, Rob.
Hey, great to have you.
Good to be here.
Thanks. We just spent some time together at a conference out in Crosbyton a couple weeks ago, dealing with giants. And so that's sort of where I want to go tonight, talk some more about that sort of stuff, and really talk about a lot of the same things that you covered at that conference because there's a lot of interesting information. But I'm one of the new guys here on the Truth Frequency Radio Network. So the audience that Truth Frequency has here probably is not familiar with you or your work. So could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and give us some more of your background, please?
Well, certainly. As you pointed out in my bio, I'm primarily a historian. I became interested in history at a fairly young age. Before I knew about Indiana Jones, I knew about a guy named Dr. George Knight, and he was the brother-in-law of the pastor at the church that I went to. And he would come over and talk about his archaeological expeditions to Israel, and I later had the good fortune of studying Greek with this man, and he was a tremendous influence on me. Of course, my parents and my grandparents on my mother's side were tremendously influential, but I've always had a fascination with the human past, and I parlayed that into a career. I began my study of history I think as a serious student of history when I read a book on the historical Dracula. One Christmas I asked my parents to indulge me in getting me a lot of books on Dracula and vampires, and they did. And one of the books that they got me was a book called Dracula, Prince of Many Faces, which is an excellent read if you want to get an idea about the historical Dracula. But it was the first book that I'd ever paid attention to the footnotes in. And it dawned on me that being a historian, that's how you do it. You research, you learn the languages of the culture, you go in and into archives and libraries, and that's how you do the groundwork of history. And so that sort of was a revelation of sorts for me in terms of how exactly you conduct historical research, how you identify yourself as a historian. And that sort of set me on another path. And my undergraduate work I did at Hardin-Simmons University in Abilene, Texas, and just sort of worked my way through the cultural sciences, I suppose you might say, history and anthropology and archaeology, and was persuaded to do a PhD at Texas Tech, and that's what I did. I, in addition to being a historian, I also have anthropological and archaeological training, which I put to use on a number of projects. Continue to put to use on a number of projects, in fact. So I sort of wear the shoes of three different professions, although I pay the bills with one of those, you know. But in terms of how I became interested in this work, I've really always been fascinated by mythology. And I wondered as a youngster what the biblical narrative allowed. And as I went through my studies and gained the various degrees that I attained, I never really put that fascination to the wayside. And I was always looking to see what sorts of historical value mythology had to it. And the issue of the Nephilim I'd kind of put on the back burner until I worked at Caesarea Philippi, which is a site at the base of Mount Hermon, a very famous stop on Jesus' ministry. And I became, I suppose, reinvested in the idea of researching giants. And at that point, I began to go back and look at documents like the Book of Enoch and Jubilees, Jasher, the Genesis Apocryphal, and the corpus of texts that came to make up the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when I began my PhD, I proposed the topic of doing a religious history of Caesarea Philippi, which is an extensive history certainly over time. It's one that dates back to prehistory, so it was a pretty extensive project. And as I did my dissertation, of course, being in the geographical locale of Mount Hermon, for those who know anything about the story of the Nephilim, that's a very important geographical feature in that narrative. And questions came up again and again about the topic of giants that I couldn't necessarily put into the narrative of my dissertation. Not that they were completely unrelated, but they were somewhat peripheral to what I was trying to accomplish in my dissertation. Nevertheless, I had developed such a burning curiosity about it that I kept writing these studies, these little culture sketches and essays, and they eventually made their way into the book Interview with the Giant that I wrote a few years back. But in essence, I really feel like that my profession as a historian, and certainly as a researcher on the Nephilim, is not only a professional calling, but it's also a spiritual calling. I feel that this is a work that God has placed in my life and has appointed this task to me. But that's kind of where I come from, a little bit of my background.
So you got into your whole profession because of Dracula.
Well, I can't blame it completely on Dracula, but that book, as I pointed out, not only was fascinating just superficially, but it opened my eyes to the rigors of research and how you went about doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talked about footnotes, and I've often commented myself that I both love and hate footnotes. I love them because I consider myself a researcher, and by that I mean when I see a footnote, I'll get excited because that allows me to go and search that which has been searched by others before me. Mm-hmm. But the problem with that for me is I'll be reading a book, and if they've got extensive footnotes, I'm in heaven. I love it because then I can really go on a journey. But the problem is I usually end up putting that book down to go get the other book that he's referencing. Then I'll get that book and I'll read it, and if that book has footnotes that are intriguing, I got to get that. So I usually end up having at least 4 to 5 books in various stages of completion at all times on my nightstand. Sure. None of them completed totally.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it is. In your research, now, do they tie Dracula to Vlad the Impaler?
Well, this particular book did. The book was written by 2 Eastern European scholars. I don't even know if they're alive now, but Radu Florescu and Raymond McNally, they made a big splash with their research on the historical Dracula back in the 70s and 80s. The only connection that they make with between Vlad the Impaler and Dracula, of course, is the one that Stoker made, which is almost entirely literary. There's no connection between the historical Dracula and, let's say, the vampire lore of Eastern Europe. Don't find that in certainly not in any of the literature of the period. But there was a profusion of, that was the 15th century. Gutenberg's printing press had just come out, and people were making use of it and putting out all of these pamphlets. And so there were these sort of propaganda campaigns toward the end of his life and after his life to sort of smear his reputation. And though he was bloodthirsty, that's for sure. Though his tactics seem particularly gruesome to us these days, there doesn't seem to be any direct correlation between the vampires of Eastern Europe or the Balkans and Vlad the Impaler. He was more like a George Washington kind of a figure in Romanian history.
It's funny you should mention George Washington as one of our presidents. Many people have heard me talk about the fact that all of our presidents are related. And when I think it was either ABC or CBS, I forget which, but they jumped on that, did a story on it when Bush was president, W. And they made mention of the fact that George W. was in fact related to Vlad the Impaler. So, yeah, I thought that was rather interesting, especially if there was any connection to him being an actual vampire. But you seem to have dashed that one. So,
well, on a spiritual level, I mean, it's hard to deny that there's something demonic going on there behind his behavior. But just in terms of the historical paper trail, or maybe even the folkloric trail, there doesn't seem to be a direct correlation. Most of the people who fought with Vlad the Impaler, that is, Romanians that fought on his side, lauded him as something of a hero because he fought against the Turks as they were trying to make their way into Eastern Europe.
Now, you've told us a little bit about how you got involved in this subject already, but you're an academic. You're a professor. You teach at various schools. How is the idea of giants received in your circles?
Usually with raised eyebrows.
I can imagine.
But I've been fortunate in the colleagues that I have around me, even if they don't believe in the existence of giants, they can appreciate the paper trail that they've left, and that there's an intellectual history that deals with the giants. There's a corpus of literature from the early church period. There are documents that date back to the Second Temple period. That they may not agree with me, but they know that I've done my time, so to speak. I went through the trenches and went through the same academic rigors that they did, and so they can at least respect the approach that I'm taking with the topic. So
they consider you a peer. They consider, that they acknowledge the journey that you've been on, and that you're academic about it. You've documented it. You showed the documentation. You footnoted it, so they can appreciate that. But they're raising their eyebrows, thinking, "Yeah, giants." But what do they do with the idea that, well, pretty much every single culture on the planet has some sort of folklore, myth, or story about giants?
Well, even though I've been fortunate in my peers, they're the glaring exception to the rule in academia. Mm-hmm. The current paradigm, of course, and this has been the paradigm really since, really over the last 50 or 60 years, is that these stories of giants and other mythological creatures, for that matter, are simply rhapsodic or literary. That these are people who are just flexing their religious imaginations, or they're trying to make sense of a natural world that they don't have the toolkit to understand, the intellectual toolkit to understand. That argument only works so far. It only works up to a point. In the case of giants, where you have both a physical evidence trail and a historical trail, a paper trail, on some level it should be compelling, because as you and I have noted, and our peers in this field have noted, you're hard-pressed to spin the globe and stop at any place and find a culture that doesn't have at least some story about giants. And in those cultures that had written traditions, we have, documents that point to their existence. I'm dealing with this issue in much the same manner that I would deal with any other academic problem, any research problem that I had. If I had inscriptions to record in the Golan, for instance, I would apply the same sorts of rigor to that project that I am to the topic of giants. But one of the problems is that on the physical anthropological side, the human, the fossil biology side, giants don't fit within the evolutionary scheme.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, evolution, after the advent of Darwin's take on evolution and all the different permutations of that idea that have occurred since, evolution has not only impacted the biological and the hard sciences, but it has impacted the social sciences and liberal arts as well. So that you're hard-pressed to find an academic or a scholar who has not been not only heavily influenced by these ideas, but in many cases, they're so influenced that they've become ensconced and can't really break out of thinking along the lines of linear progression, this evolutionary progression, this dialectic, system. Speaking of vicious cycles. Mm-hmm. But giants don't fit neatly within the hominid fossil record, and that's a huge problem for people who aren't even anthropologists.
Yeah, did you see the movie Expelled with Ben Stein?
Yes, I did.
I think that movie perfectly illustrates that whole paradigm and how, I mean, it's like academic suicide for a lot of these guys to touch anything that would smack in the face Darwinian, smack Darwinian evolution in the face, and say that doesn't fit that paradigm.
Well, certainly. I mean, it's a glaring double standard. We're supposed to have complete academic freedom, but I mean, what does that mean under a postmodern paradigm? Well, what it's come to mean is that if you don't toe the party line, then you may be in danger of having your tenure revoked or having your character besmirched, or any number of sort of negative ramifications to your own career and your character, as I pointed out. Mm-hmm. But it amazes me that all of these government-funded agencies and even a lot of private agencies that support the sciences and the arts, National Geographic, there's a laundry list of them. And that's just the first one that comes to my mind. But, they throw tons of money at projects to find
the missing link.
Monkeys in Southeast Asia that are thought only to be folkloric, but turn out to be actual living species. Mm. How is, with the proper scientific rigor applied to the problem, how is the issue of giants any different than that?
Yeah.
Well, the clear answer is that it shouldn't be.
Right. Now, when we're talking about giants, how do we define a giant? I mean, is there like a cutoff height for normal people, and anything above that is considered a giant? What's the height requirement for somebody to be considered a giant?
Well, usually when people think, when scholars think of giants, they think of people who are afflicted with gigantism, which of course is something separate from what we're talking about here. That has to do with all kinds of hormonal and chemical imbalances within the body that cause the elongation of tissues and bones, and in some cases the malformation of bones. That is a completely and separate, completely different issue here. the giants, or the Nephilim, if you want to use the biblical context, these giants, particularly the pre-flood giants, seem to have been quite tall. We have record of comparison. One of the comparisons, as you well know, Rob, is to the mountain cedars in Anna, Lebanon, and Golan regions. Now, these cedars could, not uncommon for them to be 15, 20, 30 feet tall. That's a pretty tall dude.
Yeah.
If you've got a 30-foot tall guy, that's taller than a lot of the quadrupedal megafauna, the mammoths and mastodons that used to roam this continent. But the post-flood, we seem to have a diminishment in stature, because you're really dealing with two different biospheres. And we can flesh that out as much as you want to.
Yeah,
or not. But long story short, you're dealing with two kinds of environments. So that the antediluvian world ostensibly had a higher oxygen-nitrogen ratio. Greater oxygenation has been proven in laboratory science to render fuller genetic expression and larger, more healthier creatures.
All right. Hold that thought. We're going to go to a 3-minute break, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the post-flood giants.
Evil contains within it the seed of its own destruction.
Truth Warrior with David Whitehead. Mondays on Truth Frequency Radio.
And we're back. You're listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and tonight we're talking with Dr. Judd Burton about giants. And before we went to the break, we were talking about the size difference in the giants in the pre-flood world versus the post-flood world. And you're talking about the giants, the size of cedar trees. That comes from one of the prophets of the Old Testament, the prophet Amos, in Amos 2:9. It says, "Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them," I being God, "though his height was like the height of the cedars, and he was strong as the oaks. I even destroyed his fruit above and his root below." So, Judd, let's back up a little bit and talk about the pre-flood world. What can you tell me about the origin of the Nephilim and the size of them before the flood?
Sure. Well, really the beginning of that story is it starts with the Genesis 6 passage. Although it's not very expansive, it does sort of distill the story to us. And again, a lot of people will be familiar with the passage, but this is the passage that relates the coming down of the sons of God, the Benach Elohim, who were angels. The usage of that phrase in the Old Testament very often is in reference to angels, and so it's pretty clear what the idiom is here. There have been scholars who have tried to twist this into something that it's really not, making it ETs or something. But you can't make the passage say anything other than what it says.
Or the sons of Seth. That's the
Semites. Exactly, which is completely absurd. I mean, whatever, just on the basis of language, if you just look at it linguistically, even if people don't have any, spiritual investment in the passage, the language says what it says. It says angels, and it says that they mated with human females, and they produced this line of creatures, the Nephilim. who, again, although this is a multifaceted word, it has nuances. The clearest nuance in this passage seems to be giant, because when you look at not only the very similar words in the region in other West Asian languages such as Aramaic, the word for giant is Nephilah. But when you look at later productions of the Old Testament scriptures, in the case of the Septuagint, which was produced in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, these are a set of scholars who are familiar with both their Jewish roots and the Greek world at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So they knew exactly the word to choose to clarify that idiom to a Greek-speaking audience. And the word that they chose was the Greek word for giants, gigantes. So we have that clarification too. What the production that we have clearly here in Genesis 6, in this union between these rebellious angels, these apostate angels, and human females, is a production of this line of giants, these creatures, the Nephilim. Where it gets, and certainly there's these giants show up in other passages in the Old Testament under other tribal names. But just in terms of this antediluvian episode, this instance before the flood, we have some pretty interesting commentary on books from the collectively known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, most notably the Book of Enoch. And Enoch is interesting because it really fleshes out the details of the antediluvian world, what the culture was like at that time. And certainly it gives us a clearer picture of the nuances of the story of how all of this came about, how the Genesis 6 episode actually unfolded. Why should we care anything about these apocryphal texts, these extra-biblical texts? Well, you've done quite a bit of work on this very issue, but just in terms of repeating that for purposes of driving it home, many of these books are referenced in the accepted scriptures, the canonical scriptures. And to go one further, when you get to the early church period, and this was something that I noticed when I was doing my research, the rock stars of the early church period, Athenagoras and Tertullian and Origen, all of these guys are referencing these works. They're referencing Enoch, and Joshua, and Jubilees, Book of Giants, etc., etc. So they likely didn't consider them canon, but they considered them valuable for teaching tools. If Old Testament authors and New Testament authors and the early church fathers reference this material, then I think that's a compelling reason for people today, believers in the church, whoever, to take a closer look at these non-canonical works, because they're made out of the same culture that produced the Bible.
Yeah,
these are the same people. It's the same. These are the same oral traditions, ostensibly going back to prehistory. Israel doesn't really have a written language until the United Kingdom period. It begins with Saul, and even then they're borrowing, bits and pieces from other West Asian languages, or at least in terms of writing system. But when they write this stuff down, who knows how old these traditions were? They're to say that they're ancient is probably euphemistic. Primeval is probably a better word to describe their antiquity. But they come out of the same culture that produces the Bible. The biblical authors were inspired by God And if they're referencing these works, then again, that's to my mind that's a both on a Go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, it sounds like a pretty good endorsement.
Well, yeah. I mean, both on a spiritual and an academic level. I mean, it would if one believes that God inspired these authors to reference these books, then that's a compelling reason to take a closer look. From an academic perspective, if you're looking at the intellectual tradition, that too is a compelling reason. These people believed that God told them to reference these other books. Which brings us back to Enoch and the antediluvian world, where we have this record of, in the days of Jared, 200 of these watcher angels. These are the same sons of God that are referenced in Genesis 6. Came down to Mount Hermon. Obviously, they had thrown in their lot with Satan, who had rebelled against God. And they made a pact to mate with human females. And another one of the details we get is there seems to be some sort of exchange here. Genetic access for the teaching of what appears to be a combination of practical sciences and occult knowledge. So it's this strange, otherworldly marriage of practical things like meteorology and herbal medicine with astrology and the teaching of abortion and seduction and warcraft. That seems to be the token of exchange for this access. And again, referring back to both Enoch and Genesis 6, the product of this union were the Nephilim.
Now, Josephus makes the connection that this first generation offspring were he likened them to the Titans of Greek mythology.
That's right.
Comment on that.
Well, like the I think it's an apt comparison because again the exchange here seems to be the basis for the building of human culture, or not just human culture but civilized culture. And what I mean by civilized culture is city dwelling. Mm-hmm. The word civilized comes from the Latin civis for city, but you have a sharp change in the way that humans are socially organizing themselves. Whatever chronology somebody ascribes to, whether it's an old Earth or a young Earth chronology or whatever in between, what happens very clearly is that you have, for all intents and purposes, a kind of herding, maybe your hunting-gathering culture. And now you have humanity being able to smith metals and plant, basically. You've got with the watching of the seasons and the more intimate knowledge of plants comes the advent of agriculture. And in human history, this was so important that scholars like Vera Gordon Child, a very noted field archaeologist, called this the Neolithic Revolution. Not only because of the advent of agriculture, which allowed for the building of these cities, these sedentary walled societies, because you have to have agriculture first. You have to have that stable food supply. But it changed the way that humans socially organize themselves from that point on. Now, obviously not all hunter-gatherers became city dwellers, but there was that option now. And when looking at that change through the lens of not only the Old Testament, but these apocryphal works, what becomes clear, at least in my mind, is that there's a very clear role that these watcher angels are playing in terms of being culture founders, or what is referred to in mythological terms as culture heroes. That's why I think that not only in the case of the first generation of Nephilim, but also the Watchers. I think that Josephus's comparison is very apt because a lot of listeners will be familiar with Prometheus, for instance, from Greek mythology. It was a titan that gave fire, ostensibly, to humanity. And this angered Zeus because fire allowed for, amongst other things, civilization, the building of cities and industry and things like that. There's a very clear comparison in my mind here that Josephus is making, an apt one and an accurate one.
Now, from my research, it was the unanimous opinion of the ancient world that we're dealing with, as the History Channel would call ancient aliens, as you and I would call angels. That appears to have been the unanimous view of the ancient world until about 200 AD, somewhere thereabouts, when Julius Africanus shows up and says, I don't think I want to believe that anymore. I think that doesn't make sense to me. I think it's the sons of Seth. Is that what you found? Did you find that the ancient record was unanimous as well, or did you find anything that disagreed with that prior to 200 AD?
No, most ancient peoples took the claims of their religions at face value. They believed wholeheartedly in their mythologies because, again, in the ancient world, that line between mythology and history is not nearly so clearly drawn as it is today in our intellectually compartmentalized world. Until late antiquity, with notable figures like Julius Africanus, you don't really see that. And interestingly enough, it's amongst some of the churchmen of late antiquity who begin to poo-poo that idea. But before that, going back to antiquity and beyond, people believed wholeheartedly in these councils of gods and councils of demigods and heroes and things like that.
Yeah, and when you look at the accounts, even in the Greek mythology of the Titans, they were just insanely huge. I mean, they were ridiculously huge. Even in the movies that are coming out these days, the Percy Jacksons and the Clash of the Titans and all that. And it's kind of interesting. You had Wrath of the Titans and the second Percy Jackson movie come out. And I think in both movies they were releasing the same entity, Kronos. And they depict him as several hundred feet tall in those movies, and rightfully so, because as the ancients do as well. In the Book of Enoch says that the pre-flood first generation Nephilim got to 3,000 ells, and I've got an edition of Enoch by Dr. A. Nyland, and Dr. Nyland says that 3,000 ells is equal to about 300 cubits, which I found interesting. If true, that's 450 feet, which is the same dimensions as the length of the ark. So I thought, how poetic. The ark is about the same dimensions as a coffin for a 450-footer Kronos or something, So, I mean, they're just like, I can't wrap my mind around a 450-foot tall creature, but the ancients didn't seem to have a problem with it. They were writing about it. But then, and I think as you were pointing out before the break, the world was very different before the flood, which allowed for gigantism, not just as a result of angels mating with humans, but I mean, we've got all kinds of fauna around the world. I mean, dragonflies with several foot wingspans and stuff. So, care to talk about that a little bit? What was the environment of the pre-flood world like, and why was that conducive to larger life forms?
Sure. Well, I would argue that not only the pre-flood world, but even the early post-flood world, was drastically different. We have evidence of that. Just in terms of the megafauna that existed not only in the Western Hemisphere but also in the Eastern Hemisphere, notable creatures such as the mammoth and the mastodon, and all of the species of large cats, the saber-toothed cats, the giant wolves, the short-faced bear, the giant sloth, and even going back before the Pleistocene, to the age of the dinosaurs. There were again, depending on what chronology you subscribe to, whether you put them before or after the flood, these creatures were immense. And what's interesting to me in the case of the dinosaurs, and I want to qualify this by saying that I am not a paleontologist, but what's interesting to me in the case of the dinosaurs is that their lung capacity seems to be so out of proportion with the size of their bodies.
Yeah.
And that would only be possible with an atmosphere that had a richer oxygen content. And what we find even in, even the staunchest evolutionary driven geologist who takes a core sample will tell you that that's the case, that the farther back in geologic time you go, the greater the oxygen content and the lower the nitrogen content is in the atmosphere.
When they found like bubbles in amber and stuff, didn't they find that it had a different pressure and
certainly,
yeah,
certainly. And your lung, again, in the case of these large animals, your lungs would have to work. They would be taxed far less in that kind of environment. They wouldn't have to work nearly as hard.
So, do you think normal humans got bigger also as a result, or do you think that humans have always been in the 6 to 7 foot tall max range?
I don't know if Homo sapiens did. Now we have there are some large hominid creatures like Gigantopithecus, and it seems like some of the Homo ergaster specimens that they found in the East Indies were over 8 feet tall. So there are some hominid species, but I don't know that what we would consider today normal humans ever got much taller than the average height today. But that's not to say that if they were living in the pre-flood world, they would have attained whatever their full genetic expression was.
Mm-hmm.
Which could have been, could have had greater muscle mass, could have been a bit taller.
That's what I was going to say, is in my research specifically related to the liger, what they found was when they mated a male lion with a female tiger, there was no growth inhibitor gene. It was either missing altogether or it was turned off. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they so if you have a male lion and a female tiger, you get a liger that just keeps growing until it dies because nothing tells it when to stop. But if you have a male tiger and a female lion, you don't have that same thing because it's in the male tiger and in the female lion that code apparently exists. And so the Tigons, they don't get big. They get the size of a tiger or a lion gets, whereas the ligers get massively huge. So, based on that empirical evidence, I was saying when I talk about the subject that I've got a code in my genome that said Rob stops growing at 5'11" at age 16. Mm-hmm. So if that is, and if you and I and everybody else listening to this has inherited that genetic code going all the way back to the first humans, Adam and Eve, then it would seem that we were probably capped out at maybe 7 and change. Because there are certainly people that still get to that height today.
Sure.
And it seems that at least nowadays, a giant is defined really 8 feet and above. Is that what you found?
Yes, generally, yeah.
I found a neat picture from Conan the Barbarian with Arnold Schwarzenegger standing next to Wilt Chamberlain and Andre the Giant. And Arnold's not a short guy either. I mean, he's like 6'2" or something like that, I think. And these guys are just towering over him. I mean, he looked like a plaything.
Yeah, I've seen that picture. Yeah,
it's a great picture. People could Google that, Arnold Schwarzenegger and Andre the Giant. Probably see some pictures on Google. But let's start talking now about we got 3 minutes before the break, so we're not going to get very far, but let's transition to the post-flood world. So I think in the pre-flood world, clearly the environment was different. Do you subscribe to the canopy theory?
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Well, I think you're referring to the notion that there was a body of water.
Yes.
Yeah, above the end of that's why when I tell people I talk about this, it was a completely alien environment to what we would be used to. Generally I think that there must have been some kind of a canopy made primarily out of water, which would have provided for this more oxygen-rich environment, but B, would have repelled a lot of the harmful solar radiation that we're exposed to today. But yeah, in general, that would have been part of the pre-flood atmosphere.
You know, some people scoff at that. But, you know, as a researcher myself, I look for confirming evidence. Okay, we come up with a hypothesis. Well, can we test it? Is there anything that we can observe that would be similar? And we have such a thing right in our own solar system. The moon Europa, one of the moons of Jupiter, is just that. It has what they consider to be a volcanic, warm surface, but it's surrounded by an ice canopy.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, we've got something right here, and interestingly enough, it's kind of like you look at, what was the movie, 2010, the sequel to 2001, A Space Odyssey, and I think it dealt with that, if I remember right. It seems like Europa had something to do with that. Do you remember that movie?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, it was almost like, didn't Jupiter become like another sun or something, and Europa was like another Earth? Yeah,
and interestingly, they named the sun Lucifer.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, I just watched a documentary. Sheila found it. It's called Kubrick's Odyssey Part 2.
Okay.
And write that down. Kubrick's Odyssey Part 2 on Vimeo, and it shows basically what this guy, I forget the guy's name that did it, Jay Weidner. He does an analysis of the film, saying this is what Kubrick's really saying with this movie. And it's a trip. So you get a chance. Yeah, you definitely have to check that out. And looks like we're just about ready to go to a break. So, but just to summarize, I do believe that there was a canopy, that it had created an environment that was conducive to larger creatures and people living longer as well. In the biblical text, we see people living close to 1,000 years, but that starts to drop off in the post-flood world, and so does the size of the giants. So we'll talk about that when we come back after the break.
You must unite what has been set asunder.
We are TFR.
Truth Frequency Radio.
And we're back. You're listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and tonight we're talking with Dr. Judd Burton about giants. And before the break, we were covering the pre-flood giants and the environment that existed before the flood. and how that was conducive to larger size and longer lifespans. But then things start to change on the other side of the flood, in the post-flood world. And there are a lot of theories out there regarding how the Nephilim returned after the flood. But regardless of who's right or who's wrong, we all have the same net result. The net result is there are giants after the flood. And most notably, we see them showing up in Numbers chapter 13, when the Israelites had just come through the Exodus from Egypt, and they were going to spy out the land. They see giants in the land, and they described themselves as grasshoppers by comparison. And they repeatedly state in that 13th chapter of the book of Numbers that there were great cities and people of tremendous stature, great stature. The sons of Anak were there, the Anakim. The sons of Anak were the Anakim. The Anakim came from Anak, who came from Arba, who was an Amorite who comes from the line of Canaan. So the Canaanite giants were everywhere in that land, and we saw in Amos chapter 2, verse 9, that they were as tall as cedar trees. So if you put that in perspective, and I like to depict things like that whenever I can, to show what that might have looked like, I've created a 3D picture of a 6-foot tall human as compared to a 36-foot cedar tree-sized Amorite, and it helps you understand why the Hebrew spies were like, they gave a bad report, but yet you have Caleb and Joshua, and Caleb's like, hey, what's the problem? We can do this. We are well able to overcome it. That shows tremendous faith that individual had. So I know this is a subject that you're passionate about, but I want to say something here, because you and I had a interesting conversation over lunch a couple days ago, and one of the things that you and I have in common is in our younger years we took martial arts and various different types of martial arts, and you had a very interesting insight regarding some of the weapon moves in some of the disciplines like Kung Fu. Talk to us about that a little bit.
Well, yes, younger and thinner days. But yeah, when people think of the martial arts, they typically think of a Kung Fu movie or something like that. And some of the most cohesive systems that we have, the most complete systems we have, come out of East Asia. So in all fairness, there's a lot that's preserved there that you don't find in other parts of the world. But in general, a martial art or a martial system is simply a way of fighting. It's simply a regimented way of fighting. And in the case of, again, thinking anthropologically about the issue of giants, you have to factor in that people fought them, because we have record of people fighting them on both sides of the globe. I mean, the Native Americans talk about fighting them and wiping them out in North America. So obviously they were having success. But just looking at the issue of fighting giants in the Levant, in the ancient Near East, you obviously cannot take away the supernatural element, because if we're to believe the narrative, Yahweh was on the side of the Israelites, going before them, helping them, in this case, fighting the giants. But there's also the pragmatic, on-the-ground issue. Mm-hmm. In other words, how are they actually fighting the giants? Now, the big example that comes to mind, and in fact the most popular example of a fight between a human and a giant, is David and Goliath. And that's a very unorthodox way for West Asian armies to fight. West Asian armies didn't fight like that. This is something that's more reminiscent of champions calling each other out in Greek mythology. You'd find Hector and Achilles squaring off like this in the Odyssey. It would make more sense in Homeric literature, ostensibly. But what I begin to consider is what are the nuts and bolts of this? And it occurred to me that in looking at the battle between David and Goliath, the Battle of Elah, that David is closing the distance. He uses a distance weapon to begin with. Now, armies, of course, would have distance weapons like contingents of archers. So you've got bows and arrows, javelins and spears of all kinds, and then you would come in closer with weapons like swords and daggers, maces, and things of that nature. But it's very clear that David is closing the distance in much the same way that prehistoric men hunted these large megafauna that we've been talking about. They would use distance. Usually that was done in groups, though, the hunting of megafauna. But at any rate, he's closing the distance. Getting back to your original reference to the martial arts, I began to wonder about, well, what about all these other instances that we have of wars against giants and giants like Sion and Og that are referenced in the Old Testament being taken down? How did the Hebrews fight these giants? And they were fighting them well into the conquest period and even the early occupation period, the period of the judges, and indeed in the United Kingdom period as well. So we know that they were fighting them with some frequency. Well, the question occurred to me, how did they do this? What weapons did they use? What were the techniques that they were used? And so I began to look for analogs in martial arts systems around the world. And the one that really caught my eye were some of the spear systems that were used in the Chinese systems of martial arts, collectively known, popularly known as Kung Fu. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these spears are at least a time and a half as big as, or I should say a time and a half as tall as a person is. And if you look at a number of these systems, they're developed so that the thrusts make full use of the length of the spear, and the thrusts are usually upward. They're usually at an angle. And there are also these long, arcing, circular movements in which the tip of the spear is actually being used as kind of a bladed weapon, almost as if you had a long sword. And this is kind of a tack that I'm taking right now in my research, and it's only so much speculation at this point. But I surmise that techniques similar to this would have been used after distance had been closed, after giants had been weakened, with distance weapons like bows and arrows and javelins. You would then close the distance with these with weapons like spears, and if need be, go in with weapons like swords. But you would want to weaken these things as much as you possibly could at a distance and then move in. But it seems to me that the use of the spear and techniques similar to those that were used in China and other parts of East Asia would have suited combating these, not only combating giants, but obviously defeating them.
Yeah, you and I were talking about one of the styles of martial arts that we both did, which was Bruce Lee's concept of Jeet Kune Do. Mm-hmm. And what I loved about Jeet Kune Do was he basically said, why should I waste time trying to teach you technique that you may not have the attributes to be able to do? Mm-hmm. So his whole idea was, let's figure out what your natural attributes are, and then find a martial art discipline that fits your attribute and hone it. And like I was never really good at the getting off the ground and
yeah, me either.
the jumping and flipping and the kicking and stuff. I was much better with my hands, and so I really gravitated to that style because it allowed me to use techniques that my own personal attributes would work with. But I remember something that a quote from Bruce Lee was, "I would no more kick you in the head than I would punch you in the toe." Mm-hmm. That it's flashy and it makes for cool cinema, but in a practical fight, that wasn't something that he would do. Mm-hmm. But if we think in terms of there's several martial arts styles that have people up in the air doing stuff, and these very high kicks and stuff like that. Well, I mean that would make sense if you're going up against a 12 or 15 footer. I mean, now you're kicking groin level.
Sure.
To get up off the ground like that. To do some of these moves, it makes sense if they're training for a giant fight. And you and I were discussing this over lunch and just thinking about the fact that the Israelites were in the wilderness for 40 years. And there's this whole young generation, the older generation had to die off, but it was the younger generation that really grew up in the wilderness that then went in under the leadership of Joshua and did the giant eradication campaign. Mm-hmm. So, how do you think do you think they were out in the wilderness for 40 years doing, of course, the sacrifices and the things that Yahweh wanted, but also practicing some form of martial art? Oh,
certainly. On one level, they would have been affected, I think, culturally by their time in Egypt, and we know that the Egyptians, they're recorded in their hieroglyphs. We know that the Egyptians also had a regimented system of martial arts. The name escapes me, but they had one. And of course, their soldiery would have been trained, in this. Again, it's just a way of conducting a war. It's a way of fighting. But yeah, I can't help but think that they would have been influenced by the Egyptian system because of the time that they spent there. But they probably would have come in contact with other systems as well. But you're right. You make a good point about this older generation dying off, and this younger generation coming up and spending this time in the desert, in the wilderness. These were hardened people. Mm-hmm. They were hardened by the conditions of the desert environment that they lived in. We get a picture of just how difficult that was from the biblical narrative itself. It in a way, it reminds me of, for all the sci-fi fans out there, it sort of reminds me of the Fremen from Dune, who also had very, sort of rigorous coming of age trials and things like that. These sorts of things on a nuanced level that we may not be able to see on this side of history, undoubtedly, would have taken place. So, by the time they get to the conquest, the period of the conquest, although they're not a regular army, these are people who know how to fight.
Yeah,
undoubtedly. But you also make good points about the high kicking. There are systems around the world that not only have, lots of flying high kicks and gymnastics. Wushu is one that comes to mind from China. But I also think about systems that make the full use of the arc of a kick and the weight that can be brought to bear by a kick, such as capoeira from Brazil, that the slaves practice. Some of those kicks make use of a full arc, a full circle. That's pretty deadly. Wherever you land that kick, it's gonna do some damage. And a lot of those are upward kicks. They're kicks that are aimed, on a normal person, that would be at the head or the neck or something like that.
Yeah, for a giant, your knee or groin level.
Exactly. The whole lower half of the body basically is the target.
We were also talking about how some cultures kind of learn the martial arts through dance.
Yes, that system, capoeira, would have been one such system. It was developed by the slaves in South America and hidden in dance. Now, ostensibly, similar systems would have developed throughout the slave-holding portions of the Americas, but capoeira is certainly the most well-known, the most storied, the most popular. But there are any number of systems from Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa, that sort of incorporate the dance and the martial element. There are systems in India and the East Indies that also make use of dance in at least in the learning process of these martial systems. So a lot of them are maybe not necessarily now so much hidden in dance as they are just part of the dance and learning process itself.
That takes on a whole new meaning when we think about David being a dancer.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Because like Joshua and Caleb, there are all kinds of stories about the exploits of David and his mighty men, basically picking up where Joshua left off, going after these giants.
Precisely, and by the time, if not by the time of the conquest, and certainly by the time David and his mighty men are doing their work, there had to have been some sort of regimented system that existed for fighting giants.
That's pretty extraordinary when you think about it. I mean, it's just because I could see it now in my eyes. I mean, we read about it, but you don't really think, well, how did they? I mean, because the land was literally filled with these guys. I mean, they were everywhere. And but it is interesting that during the time in the wilderness, I mean, you talked about the exploits and the victories over Sihon and Og of Bashan, and the Bible actually gives us the size of Og. That depending on who you read, he's 15 to 18 feet tall. I mean, he's a big dude, and it seems to me that Sihon was either the same size or may have even been bigger, because God's like, don't worry about Og. Remember what you did to Sihon? That he's a big dude, and if this land was filled with these people, and they get these victories, by the time they got to Jericho, the testimony of Rahab in Joshua chapter 2, she's like, we've all heard of you guys. And some people place the number of the Israelites at somewhere close to a couple million, perhaps, including men, women, and children. They came in like a swarm of, presumably 6 foot tall people or ish, and taking out 15 to 30 footers.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's pretty. I mean, and if you think of them all doing Bruce Lee, or nowadays Krav Maga is making quite the comeback, I guess. It's the Israeli form of martial arts. I've seen several places around here in the Dallas-Fort Worth area popping up the Israeli martial art form. But going back to the Asian forms, Chinese and Japanese and whatnot, what I found interesting in my research is that the Chinese traced their origin back to an individual named Fo He Yu, who they describe as a guy who was with his family in a boat, and they describe him as Noah.
Yes.
And I thought, wow, because one of the other things that I've always found intriguing is, why is it that the Chinese seem to have the corner on the natural solutions for health? The herbs, the plants, the acupuncture. I mean, they seem to have all. It's almost like of all the people in the world, they really had the corner on that.
Sure.
And if all that's coming through Noah, that's pretty neat.
Yeah, it does begin to make sense, and I think without ascribing to any of the religious traditions that exist in the East, it is pretty amazing to consider the understanding of not only the interaction between the body and certain combinations of medicinal herbs or techniques like acupuncture, but there just seems to be a general better understanding of the body and how it operates in the East, and it seems to be, in many cases, peripheralized in the West, and has been so for centuries, really, I guess. But yes, that puts a whole new spin on Chinese history, I think in particular, but the history of East Asia in general. There's a book that's on my reading list that I have not had a chance to read yet, but it's I've read it piecemeal. I think it's called Finding God in Ancient China, and it's all about the worship of Yahweh in ancient China. But again, getting back to the descendants of Noah, basically creating Chinese, or let's just say proto-Chinese or proto-East Asian culture. It does definitely put an interesting slant on that part of the world.
Yeah, and I was a missionary in China in 2006 and had the privilege of standing on the Great Wall of China. And while I was there, I came to find out that the Great Wall of China was originally known as the ramparts of Gog and Magog. And, if you ever see this thing up close, it is huge. I mean, it's just massively huge. I mean, it's not only really long going throughout the country, but it's also really tall and really wide. And, as I was on the thing, I was thinking, man, this is serious overkill if it's just to keep out 6 foot tall invaders.
Yeah, it's just to keep out the Huns.
I mean, there had to be something more to it. But then when I saw that they were the ramparts of Gog and Magog, and then I did some Google searches on Gog and Magog and come to find out that they were giants, all of a sudden, okay, Great Wall of China makes a whole lot of sense. Mm-hmm. And if that's the case, then the Chinese not only would have to build a wall for protection, but would probably have to develop a lot of martial arts to defend themselves.
Precisely. Yeah. As would any people who came into contact with the giants and had to deal with them for any period of time. If you're talking about multiple generations that have to deal with the threat, yeah, just out of necessity, you're going to develop some sort of martial system that is geared directly towards fighting and defeating these things.
Yeah. Well, the Israelites were really good at it, and we're coming up on a break again, but I want to get into the subject of the diaspora of the giants. I mean, when we use that word diaspora in Christian circles, a lot of people immediately they think of when the northern tribes were dispersed throughout the world. But there was also a diaspora of the giants, and I mean, we see that Joshua and his boys were able to get most of them, most of the giants, but we see that he failed to get them in three very curious and interesting locations. Gaza, what we now call the West Bank, and the Golan Heights were the three places he failed to get the Nephilim. Interesting that those are still hotspots today. What's your take on that?
Well, I don't think it's any accident that those are still hotspots to this day. I mean, Gaza and the West Bank are the ones that are making the news these days, obviously because of the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But the Golan is equally contentious because Syria still wants that. And the Golan, of course, is where Mount Hermon is. Mm-hmm. Where all of this trouble begins.
Yeah. Now, apparently David did some more damage for the giants and got a lot of them. But between the conquests of Joshua and the conquests of David, they apparently either killed them or drove them out of the land. And where do you think that they immediately went from there, from the land of Canaan? Where did they go?
They dispersed really in all directions. The word diaspora implies that there is a wide diffusion of peoples. And that's exactly what happens with the giants. And the reason that they leave is because they got their tails kicked. Their mission failed. And the shining example of that is David and Goliath. Who was David related to? Well, there's a young rabbi who teaches us a different way in first century AD Palestine named Yeshua. He's in the line of Jesus Christ. And this was part of the plan from the beginning, was to try and destroy the bloodline or pollute the bloodline of the Messiah. And the battle between David and Goliath was a last-ditch attempt to do that.
Right on. Well, that will take us into this 3-minute break. We'll come back. We'll continue our discussion with Dr. Judd Burton on the Giants and the diaspora. We can go after that.
You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Down the rabbit hole with Popeye, Tuesday through Friday on Truth Frequency Radio.
And we're back. You're listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba, and we're talking with Dr. Judd Burton about giants. And before the break, we were talking about the diaspora of the giants that followed the campaigns of the biblical characters of Joshua and then later David and his mighty men. Where did they go after they left the Levant?
Well, the blanket answer is they went everywhere, in all directions. But at this point, you find them basically starting over, but using the same means, the same tactics, the same goals that they had been using since the beginning, which was to politically either usurp or collude with other peoples. And to either manipulate existing cultures or to get in on the ground level of the founding of others. So they disperse into a lot of places in the world where people are that is, indigenous peoples are living basically a kind of hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and not necessarily in the big city-states that you find in the Mediterranean world and the ancient Near East.
There's one character in particular that stood out to me in my research, and that is the son of Mitzrayim, Kaftor, who settled the island of Crete. And what I found interesting about that is that Greek mythology comes out of Crete. So,
certainly.
And that seems to have been even prior to the diaspora. So it seems to me that their giants had already kind of gotten out and about a bit before the big diaspora. Is that what you have found as well?
Yes, certainly there had to have been populations of giants in other places well before this post-conquest diaspora. And that, in my mind, is what creates the sort of cultural corridors that make it possible for the giants to move in all of these directions. The corridor that I've paid the most attention to of late has been the western corridor. And again, approaching this problem as I have any problem, any giant problem, I have gone back to the skills that I learned as a scholar, and went back to a number of the historians and geographers and ethnologists who I thought had some valuable things to give to the problem. People like Fernand Braudel, who paid copious attention to the role that geography played in the movement of peoples and the settlement of peoples. Jared Diamond, who's most famous for Guns, Germs, and Steel. But people like these guys factor in culture and ecology and weather and politics. It's a sort of multidisciplinary look at the movement of people and the settlement of people and what role those things play in the movement and settlement of people. And so I began to look, apply these sorts of concerns to the diaspora. And so the Western Corridor is the one that I've been looking at the most of late. Now, geographically, it's a natural thoroughfare and had been so for by the time of the diaspora during the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. The Greeks, their predecessors, the Mycenaeans and the Minoans. You mentioned Crete a moment ago. Crete was the home of the Minoans. And the Phoenicians had sent, thousands upon thousands of ships across the Mediterranean. The Greeks had colonies all around. In fact, by the time that the 9th and the 8th centuries BC roll around, the Greeks begin to sort of reassert themselves after a period of, what amounts to a dark age. But they set up colonies all around the rim of the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians did the same thing. They had colonies all across North Africa. They settled a place in what would today be Algeria, known as Carthage. They had colonies in the Iberian Peninsula, along the northwest coast of Africa, beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. So, the Phoenicians were the most adept mariners of the ancient world. So, they had created a sort of a set of cultural stepping stones for people to move, just people, humans, to move around in those circles. Now, for the giants that had colluded with these West Asian peoples, and obviously we know that there were giants amongst the Phoenicians, probably the most well-known would have been Sihon. But for any of those giants who were culturally and politically colluded with the Canaanites and the Phoenicians, those westward marches would have been made a little more easy by going through the routes of these places where the Phoenicians had set up colonies. And the same would be true of giants who were dispelled from the Greek world, who might have been making their way westward. But it's interesting that there's a train of traditions and indeed cities that are established in the wake of this diaspora. But there's some interesting evidence for these westward movements because we can look at a kind of a trail of the giants as they moved west in the Mediterranean basin on both the north coast and the southern coast. And then beyond the Pillars of Heracles, as it was known in the ancient world, the Straits of Gibraltar, to points farther westward, including the British Isles and the Americas.
Now, regarding the Americas, we got about 18 minutes left in the broadcast, and I played the conspiracy intro before our broadcast because there does appear to be a conspiracy, probably involving the Smithsonian, to cover up what we talked about earlier. The giants don't fit the Darwinian paradigm. And when it comes to the Americas, I mean, yes, as we talked about earlier, there are lots of stories of Native Americans fighting giants and stuff like that. But a little closer to home, there's some interesting stuff regarding the expedition of Lewis and Clark and Meriwether Lewis, what he may have found and what happened to him. So let's talk about that for the remainder of the broadcast, because it's fascinating. And I think we're both reading the same book. When we met there in Crosbyton and started talking about it, we're both reading the Suppressed History of America by Schrag and Hayes, and it's a fascinating book.
Yes, and they're certainly not the first to put forward the idea that that Meriwether Lewis was assassinated or killed. The popular notion, and most historians say that Lewis committed suicide.
Mm-hmm. But how did he die? That's a bizarre suicide.
Yes, Lewis, of course, most everybody knows who Meriwether Lewis is, of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Set out in 1804 to explore the northern reaches of Louisiana Territory, along with William Clark and a handful of other men known as the Corps of Discovery. Lewis was found in the fall of 1809 after staying at an inn, a hotel, with his throat slit, with 3 gunshots in him. He was shot twice, I think in the upper torso and once in the head. He was barely alive the following morning, but the shot to the head exposed his cranium. There was brain matter and blood on the floor next to him. Just looking at that scenario, it seems like a highly dubious claim that Lewis took his life.
Especially he was a military guy too. I mean, if he was skilled in knowing how to kill somebody, so you would think he would be, a lot more competent than that if he was actually going to take his own life.
Of course, yeah, of course. Now, again, the authors of the Suppressed History of America are not the first to put this idea forward, but I think it's interesting the way that they couch the alleged assassination of Meriwether Lewis, because members of the expedition did write about some pretty odd things that they found. Now, Jefferson, that is Thomas Jefferson, who was kind of a mentor to Lewis, had sent these guys out hoping that they would find, one of the popular notions of the day was that perhaps somewhere in the interior of the continent, the mammoth and the mastodon were still alive. And so this fascination, the scientific fascination that Jefferson had with the West, he was hoping that Lewis and Clark and their men would be able to find some evidence that confirmed some of his suspicions. They did write about some pretty odd stuff, that's for sure. One of the creatures that they wrote about was the Manitou, which was a kind of a shapeshifter or a werewolf. I pointed this out in my presentation at the conference, that there are a number of place names in the West that are called Manitou this, or Manitou Falls or Manitou Springs, what have you. So there's already an air of mystery about the expedition and perhaps some of the strange things that they might have seen in the West. Now, we already know this profusion of physical evidence that the Bureau of Ethnology unearths in the in parts of the West, but certainly in the proximate West, in the Ohio and the Mississippi River Valley. We know about the giant remains that come out of there. They're well documented. They're tested in the reports and journals of the Bureau of Ethnology and the Smithsonian. Again, this is so much speculation, but I have to think that because of the giant diaspora and the evidences that Lewis and Clark would have gained from talking with the Indians, they spent a lot of time treating with the Indian nations that they came in contact with, listening to their oral histories, hearing all of this stuff, and perhaps even because Lewis was the naturalist of the group, perhaps even finding physical evidence of giants out in the West, because we certainly know that there were tribes in the West, such as the Paiute and the Sioux, the Teton Sioux or the Lakota Sioux, whom the Lewis and Clark expedition did encounter. They weren't necessarily on good terms, but there were members of the Sioux that they would have encountered. These tribes certainly had tales about giants and fighting giants and defeating giants. I'm of the mind that collectively Lewis found something that would have, even in the early 19th century, would have been dangerous to what we collectively in the field call a kind of Luciferian agenda, something that grated against that agenda and would have gone against the scientific paradigm of even that day, even pre-Darwin. At any rate, it's also interesting that Lewis had waited so long, because they returned in 1806. It's 1809, and Lewis is making this trip back to D.C. to get the journals published. Why? My question is, why did it take so long? Why did he wait? Was there something that he was reticent to put in there? At any rate, he was taking this road, the Natchez Trace, which was not necessarily the safest way to go, but he was planning this trip to D.C. to get the journals published. It would have been an expedition of sorts in its own right over the Appalachian Mountains. This was something that he would have had to make great preparation for. Somebody who's considering taking their life, I don't think necessarily would have done this. Somebody who was massively depressed, I don't think would have done this. And that's not to say that Lewis didn't have his bouts of depression, but to my mind, Lewis wasn't doing all of this to end his life. He wasn't. He was certainly troubled by something, I think, which is why it took so long to get the journals ready for publication in the first place. But back to the circumstances of his death, again, to use a pun, it seems like overkill. A slit throat, 2 bullets in the, two musket balls in the upper torso, and your brain's blown out. The reason that idea of his suicide became so popular is because the 2 people closest to him in his life, his mentor, Thomas Jefferson, and his colleague, William Clark, believed that was the case.
Yeah. But I mentioned the Smithsonian earlier, and I didn't realize this until I was looking through this book, that the Smithsonian is named after a guy named Smithsonian who wasn't even an American.
Smithson, yeah, he was British.
Yeah, and as far as I can tell, he hadn't even been over here, and yet here's this institution that's supposedly created to preserve the heritage of this country, and yet we have story after story after story of any time somebody digs up a giant or some kind of, bizarre thing that goes against the scientific paradigm, the Smithsonian shows up and then everything disappears into the Indiana Jones warehouse.
Mm-hmm. Well, clearly, because I've worked with people in museums and I know how they operate, I'm reticent to point fingers at one institution, but clearly in an institution as big as the Smithsonian, you're going to have departments, in fact, people who are working on maybe the same project and have no clue as to what, it's a kind of a right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing situation. And it's a bureaucratized institution, just like any arm of government. And that's the problem, I think, is that it's been over bureaucratized from the beginning, so that there is that room for corruption, and you do have, that's why these like in Rockwall, that's why the artifacts disappear, and the ones that survive, they build a reservoir over.
Yeah, Rockwall, for our listeners that don't know, not too far from where I live is a place called Rockwall, Texas, that is named that because sometime in the 1800s, this guy was, digging a foundation or something, and his shovel hit a rock and kept digging. He saw that, wow, this looks like a rock wall. Kept digging, and come to find out it's a really long and deep, big rock wall. And apparently they found an opening in it, or busted an opening into it, and found what appears to have been a giant in there, a cannibalistic giant at that, as I understand it. Mm-hmm. And it's like, wow, here this is a 30, 45-minute drive from my house. Went out there with L.A. Marzulli to go check that out, see if we could, talk to people there that knew anything. Of course, most of the people we talked to either didn't have a clue or they weren't talking. And you're like, well, what happened to the evidence? Well, they put Lake Ray Hubbard over it. How convenient. They put a huge man-made reservoir on top of the evidence.
Yes, indeed. As an academic, I would hope that sort of thing doesn't go on, but the grim reality of it is that it does go on. And again, this brings us back to the double standard. Well, if scientific institutions and institutions of higher learning are concerned about the truth, no matter what form it may come in, what's the problem? Why the obfuscation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you would think that an exhibit at the Smithsonian of 12, 14, 15, 18 footers, they're off of Catalina Island. Giants found there. All over the place. When you get into this field of research, you find that, especially if you start looking through newspaper archives and stuff of the 1800s and even the early 1900s, giants are all over the textual record.
Mm-hmm.
People finding them, but yeah, you would think if you go to Smithsonian, if this stuff was put on display, that'd be one of the most popular displays there.
Well, and one of the most significant hominid finds ever.
Yeah, exactly.
To catch it in terms that you would think academics would be swooning over.
Except it rubs against Darwin.
Exactly.
That's so frustrating. It's got to be even more. It's frustrating for me, as just as Joe Blow, researcher who likes to read books. But for somebody like you, who digs in the dirt and is an academic scholar, this must be really frustrating for you.
It is, and it's sad more than anything. But there's value, there's merit in searching out the truth that goes beyond my nature as an academic scholar. But you're right. It can be frustrating. It is frustrating because I look at the issue and I say, even if you strip this of all the theological concerns, all the religious concerns, which you really can't, but even if you did, you still have a scientific problem. And, to quote Fox Mulder, the essence of science is asking an impertinent question, and you're on your way towards a pertinent answer. That's really what it should be about. And movies like Ben Stein's Expelled just pretty much strip away the fact that there is this glaring double standard. Despite the fact that I have been extremely fortunate in the colleagues that I have.
Well, we have 3 minutes left. Where can people find your work? What do you have available for people to check out? If you can go ahead and tell people, and you're working on a book, as I understand it, as well. So why don't you talk about that? Yes,
I've actually got a couple in the KK right now, but for now I would point people to Interview with the Giant. You can access that and purchase it through my website. There are two websites. There's the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, which is TIOBA.org. And then there's my personal website, burtonbeyond.com. And either one of those will point you to the book. There's the book that I'm dealing with right now deals with the giant diaspora. I've sort of put another one on the back burner that I had been working because I'm kind of invested in this diaspora model right now.
Yeah.
Part of which I've shared tonight. But there's also a synopsis of my work at Caesarea Philippi, which is kind of a condensed religious history of the site that I'm going to put out. But those are the two that are on the back, kind of in the KK right now.
All right. And do you have plans on doing any writing on the conehead skulls in Peru?
Not in the immediate future. Dr. Aaron Judkins and I had talked about a collaboration. He's done some work on that too. So there's a possibility that there may be some joint work between he and I at some point.
That's exciting. I would, Judd, you went, and so did Aaron, to Peru just recently, didn't you?
Last year, I went in February of 2013 with Ellie Marzulli and Richard Shaw. And then Aaron went in January. Joe Taylor also went with us, by the way. He did some really good casting work on a number of those skulls that we looked at.
Yeah, well, I hope to get both you and Joe Taylor up here to the Dallas area to do another conference like we did in Crosbyton. I think that would be a lot of fun. But that's all the time we have for tonight's broadcast. And hey, Judd, it was great talking with you again. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me on. It was my pleasure.
Awesome. All right, and that's all the time we have for the Revolutionary Radio Project. We'll see you back here next Wednesday at 11 p.m. Central Standard Time on Truth Radio Network. Good night.